All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second of the two informational sessions for the Statewide Needs Assessment. Really appreciate those who are participating with us today and look forward to our discussion. Before we begin, I will start off with a couple of logistical announcements. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. CalRecycle has Spanish interpretation of this meeting available for those of you participating in person or remote. We have Spanish interpretation headsets for those of you in the room. Please ask our team for a translation device, and if you're participating on Zoom, just click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and select the appropriate language. CalRecycle is also simulcasting the meeting in English and Spanish. Just go to the link on your screen and select English or Spanish webcast. As always, we have our disclaimer before any of our informational sessions. And while I will not be reading the entirety of the disclaimer, we just wanted to highlight that information presented in today's informational session is based on current and known facts and is subject to change. And recipients of this communication are encouraged to seek the assistance of legal counsel to comply with applicable state laws based on current facts and circumstances. All right, the purpose of today's informational session is to present findings from the recently published Statewide Needs Assessment. This informational session will not address any topics pertaining to the regulations or draft regulatory text. Sorry, please stay on the slide. So we will have a questions and answer session at the end of the presentation, and there will be 3 ways to ask questions or comments. If you are in person, we'll have a podium for you to line up. And for those on Zoom, you can use the raise your hand function to make an oral comment or use the chat box to make a written comment. Yes, next slide, please. Before we begin, we'll have our safety announcement.
Take your valuables and use exit signs. Do not use the elevators. If you cannot use stairs, you will be directed to a protected vestibule inside a stairwell. If relocated, exercise caution while crossing the street. En caso de que suene la alarma de incendios, es necesario evacuar. Tome sus objetos de valor y siga las señales de salida. No utilice los elevadores. Si no puede usar las escaleras, será dirigido a un vestíbulo protector. Si es reubicado, tenga cuidado al cruzar la calle.
All right, next slide, please. All right, today's agenda will be a series of short CalRecycle presentations that will provide information on the needs assessment, including 3 of the studies that explored collection, processing, end markets, and consumer education and access. After the presentations, we will also have a questions and answers session with our panel. Next slide, please. And with that, I will hand things off to Laura Moreno to kick off our Statewide Needs Assessment overview.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcus, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Laura Moreno, and I am an environmental program manager at CalRecycle in our policy office, helping to implement SB 54. I'll be presenting an overview of the Statewide Needs Assessment. I'm going to start today with just a little refresher of the main requirements of the Act. Assessing how to meet those requirements was the foundation of the needs assessment. The Act establishes recycling rate requirements and source reduction requirements for plastic covered material and recyclability and compostability requirements for all covered material. Each of these requirements kick in at various milestone years that I will now walk through. By 2027, the Act requires producers to source reduce plastic covered material by 10% relative to the source reduction baseline established by CalRecycle. This requirement moves up to a 20% reduction by 2030 and 25% by 2032. Plastic covered material must achieve a recycling rate of 30% on or after Jan 1, 2028, 40% on or after Jan 1, 2030, and 65% on or after Jan 1, 2032. The Act also requires all covered material to be recyclable or compostable on or after Jan 1, 2032. Next slide, please. The purpose of the needs assessment was to investigate pathways to meet the source reduction, recycling rate, recyclability, and compostability requirements that I outlined on the previous slides. The findings of the needs assessment will not only inform the PRO plan and budget, but also provide valuable information on immediate program planning and investment strategies for other players across the value chain. By collecting data and conducting analyses to understand potential pathways, it will help ensure that actions and investments made are evidence-based and address the varying needs and challenges faced by California's diverse communities. The needs assessment also lays the groundwork for future research and innovation by identifying areas where data is currently sparse, an area where there may be future opportunities. Broadly, the needs assessment analysis looked at what is happening with covered material now and what needs to happen in the future to meet requirements. As shown on this slide, there was an assessment of the current state of the system, which looked at current covered material design, access to and participation in existing programs and infrastructure, material flows through the current system, sources and impacts of contamination, the location and impacts of infrastructure, and consumer education and outreach. The assessment of the needed state of the system was built upon the findings of the current state, including how covered material design can help achieve the requirements of the Act. It identified actions producers and interested parties across the value chain may take to reduce, reuse, recycle, and compost covered material. It also identified barriers to and factors that enable behavior change, creation, and of new and expanded infrastructure and implementation of programs. The actions and investments identified in the needs assessment are not meant to be prescriptive. They're meant to illustrate how different strategies and investments provide opportunities across the entire system to achieve the requirements of the Act. The needs assessment comprised several studies. The first report which was published was the Source Reduction Baseline Study, which was at the end of 2024. More recently, 4 total reports were published on collection, processing, and end markets, 3 outlining the current state of the system, and 1 on the needed state. These reports will be addressed in more detail later in this presentation. 2 reports were also published on source reduction and material design, 1 on the current state and 1 on the needed state. 1 report was published on the Consumer Education and Access Study, which included the findings from a representative survey of Californians. This will also be discussed later in this informational session. Finally, a statewide needs assessment summary report that summarized the findings from the above studies and includes current and needed funding and statutory provisions was published, which will also be discussed later in this session. I'm going to breeze through this, but these are the needs assessment requirements in statute. CalRecycle published the various needs assessments reports to meet these requirements laid out in statute, which I will address. So multiple of the requirements were applicable to multiple studies. This include here consumer education needs for recycling, compost reuse, and reduction, and funding needs and actions necessary to achieve the requirements of this chapter. Next slide. Focusing on collection, processing, end markets, there were several statutory provisions associated with that study, including looking at existing state statutory provisions and funding sources related to market development and financial incentives, looking at the current recycling, composting, collection, and hauling system in the state, as well as the expanded access and additional recycling or composting options needed. It also looked at existing access to on-premises recycling and composting for multifamily residences and the need to expand that access, and the processing capacity and infrastructure in the state and regionally, and then current market conditions and the need to create viable, responsible end markets in the state and regionally. Continuing on, as this study had a lot of different various pieces that you will learn more about today, it also included actions and investments necessary to provide sufficient access to collection, recycling, composting, processing, and transportation to viable, responsible end markets, an evaluation of the availability or lack of availability of markets for recycled content material, factors contributing to contamination, and actions and investments needed to avoid that contamination and improve recycled and composted material, and then also the availability of responsible end markets and mechanisms to identify and expand those end markets. Next slide. Continuing on, the collection, processing, and end market study also included information on needs associated with shifting packaging or food service ware from a covered material category that is unlikely to develop sustained, viable, responsible end markets to a covered material category that has a viable, responsible end market or is likely to develop a sustained, viable, responsible end market. actions and investments necessary to improve covered material design, and an evaluation of integrating innovative and advanced technology throughout a MRF. Next slide. Looking at source reduction, which was the focus of the informational session last week, there were requirements for funding needed to implement the source reduction requirements established in Section 42057, including but not limited to investments needed to develop reuse and refill infrastructure and to provide consumers with convenient access to that infrastructure to grow and market the use of reusable and refillable packaging and food serviceware, as well as an evaluation of actions and investments that would be effective in achieving source reduction requirements. Now focusing on the consumer education and access study, the statutory provisions associated with that were the existing access to on-premise recycling and composting for multifamily residents and the need to expand that access, and then consumer education needs for recycling, composting, reuse, and reduction. Other needs assessment requirements to highlight here is PRC 42070G. The advisory board shall review any needs assessment submitted to it within 90 calendar days of receipt. And PRC 42051.1B1, the PRO plan shall include the actions and investments that the PRO will implement in order to meet the requirements of this chapter and address the needs and investments identified in the needs assessment. The needs assessment was developed through a series of contracted studies and work conducted by CalRecycle, some of which you will hear about today. New data collection and analysis was completed through 4 contracted studies over the past 4 years. Existing data, including CalRecycle data, was used, such as the recycling and disposal reporting system, our electronic annual report, and data collected through our material characterization studies. Another important source of data and information was engagement with interested parties throughout the entire process, including those listed on the slides, which include the PRO, the advisory board, local jurisdictions, facilities, haulers and recycling service providers, community-based organizations, EJ groups, California Native American tribes, as well as other interested parties. And as many of you know, the first statewide needs assessment culminated in a series of published reports that I previously described. As many of you know, CalRecycle scheduled 2 information sessions, one which was last week on April 6th, which focused on the source reduction requirements, including reuse and refill. Today's informational session focuses on the requirements related to recycling rate, recyclability, and compostability, and we'll go over the collection, processing, and end market reports, as well as the portion of the consumer education and access report that is focused on recycling and composting. Now I will go over a brief summary of the summary report that I mentioned previously that CalRecycle published. The summary report, which you can see on this slide, provides highlights from each needs assessment report and links findings across the report. It also includes information on how the first recycling rates for covered material were estimated, which was based on some findings from the needs assessment, as well as information collected during the recently published material characterization study. It also provides information on existing programs and laws that intersect with the Act. Now I will provide a few highlights for the summary reports over the next few slides. So first, one of the main findings was that solutions that work for all are necessary to allow for widespread adoption. Creating a system built for everyone rather than only offering a specialty or niche option will allow for more sustainable and equitable change. Additionally, early investments that make sustainable choices accessible within existing shopping patterns that leverage inclusive design choices combined with long-term infrastructure that reduces cost and increases convenience can ensure systems work for all communities. Notably, the upstream decisions made by manufacturers and producers about the composition and design of covered material will have widespread downstream impacts on the actions and investments needed. Material design changes play a critical role in this transition. Simplification, standardization, and harmonization of covered materials can streamline the entire supply chain, reducing costs, improving public health, and delivering environmental benefits. Another finding of the needs assessment is that different types of covered material currently have varying levels of collection, processing, and recycling across the state. For example, glass is widely collected, processed, and sent to end markets, while polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, is not. Covered materials also have varying levels of reuse and refill infrastructure and source reduction alternatives. Access to services additionally varies by community, with lower income and rural communities found to be less likely to have access to recycling services and source reduced alternatives, including reuse and refill. Infrastructure that handles covered material is commonly located in areas identified as already carrying high pollution burdens, which can overlap with communities that have little access to recycling services. The collection and processing of covered materials for recycling is highly dependent on end markets, including that the material has sufficient market value and stability of that value. Another highlight of the needs assessment is that education and outreach across the entire value chain will be important for influencing change across the system. This includes education ranging from consumers to decision makers along the entire supply chain. Education and outreach could be further simplified and made more effective if coupled with covered material design changes, simplifying behavior changes. As previously noted, material design choices influence whether an item can be effectively collected, sorted, and sent to end markets. Reducing the types and complexity of covered material in the market is expected to make it easier for consumers to properly sort material, which in turn can simplify education and outreach needs, resulting in reduced contamination and improved recycling yields. Next, we will move to a high-level summary of findings of studies associated with recycling, composting, and that recyclability, compostability, and the recycling rate. And I'll pass it over to Javier Garcia to go over in more detail the findings from the report related to consumer education and access.
Hello, everybody. I'm Javier Garcia, an environmental scientist in the knowledge integration section at CalRecycle, and I'll be walking us through the key findings of the consumer education and access study. First, however, I'll give a high-level overview of the engagement that was done as part of the needs assessment, including the consumer education and access study. Education and access related to source reduction, reuse, refill, and recycling and composting was assessed in multiple studies through various ways for different purposes. A representative survey of Californians was conducted to assess education needs and access to recycling, composting, and source reduction activities in the consumer education and access study. Because a representative sample of Californians was surveyed, it allows for statistical and other analyses to be performed on that data set to get findings that represent Californians. To engage further with community members and community-based organizations, listening sessions were used for the source reduction and material design study, as well as the collection, processing, and end market study. Surveys focusing on priority populations were also used in the collection, processing, and end market study. And finally, the source reduction and material design study contractor attended community and pop-up events. Next slide. The consumer education and access study consists of an internally developed statewide survey which focuses on evaluating consumer knowledge of and participation in recycling, composting, source reduction, and reuse activities. The survey investigates consumer access to waste collection and source reduction activities and how people receive information about those activities, as well as waste sorting behaviors, habits, and motivations. Now I'll go over some key details in relation to the recycling and composting part of the survey. 2,297 adult Californian residents were surveyed. This number includes demographic quota groups to ensure proper representation of California's adult population, including meeting quotas for certain priority populations, which allowed for comparisons between groups such as differences between rural versus suburban and suburban communities, multifamily properties versus single-family homes, as well as respondents with different levels of household income. The study identified existing access to on-premise recycling and composting at multifamily residences, identified priority populations that engaged in and have access to alternative collection methods, and lastly, evaluated consumer knowledge of proper sorting of plastic and non-plastic items. Now we'll go over some key findings regarding access and participation in curbside recycling from the consumer education and access study. A majority of respondents say that they have and used recycling bins, about 87%, and green material bins, about 75%. For both bin types, availability is roughly twice as much of a response as lack of use. Low income and rural respondents are more likely to say that bins are not available or are available, but they do not use them compared to higher income and suburban and urban respondents. Compared to single-family respondents, multifamily respondents are more likely to say bins are not available, about 15% saying so, compared to 5% in single-family respondents. Multifamily respondents are less likely to have their own bins, with 50% of the respondents reporting so, compared to 91% in single-family respondents. Multifamily respondents are more likely to share bins with other households, with 46% of respondents reporting so, compared to 7% in single-family respondents. Multifamily and rural respondents are more likely to report not using recycling or green bins because sorting is too much work. 39% of respondents report that the common motivator for those who do not recycle is more recycling bin and dumpster availability. 33% of low-income respondents, 31% of rural respondents, and 37% of multifamily home respondents are most motivated to recycle more by more bin availability. Now we will go over some key findings regarding access and participation in alternative recycling methods. The study found low-income and multifamily households are less likely than their counterparts to use alternative recycling methods. 51% of respondents say that they utilize drop-off recycling centers, while more than 25% do not use any alternative recycling methods. 49% of low-income respondents, 55% of rural respondents, 48% of multifamily home respondents, and 56% of tribal respondents indicate that they use drop-off recycling centers. Among priority populations, low-income and rural respondents are less likely than higher income and suburban respondents to say that their needs are being met by available services and are more likely to say alternative recycling methods are not locally available. Now we will go over some key findings regarding knowledge of and sorting behaviors. Although most respondents report that they recycle, about 95% saying so, many are uncertain on how to prepare recyclables before placing them in bins, identify chasing arrow symbols and resin codes on plastic items, and properly sort plastic items in the correct bin. A majority of respondents are incorrectly disposing of LDPE number 4 and PS number 6 plastics, and 46% are incorrectly disposing plastic utensils and straws in the recycling bin. Respondents generally report properly disposing of most non-plastic items. Exceptions include paper milk cartons, with 66% of respondents placing them in recycling, 39% of respondents placing aseptic cartons in recycling, and 30% of respondents placing wooden boxes in recycling. Compared to single-family respondents, multifamily respondents are more likely to place all trash, recycling, and green waste in a single bin, with 23% reporting so, compared to 12% in single-family homes. Lastly, we'll go over some key findings regarding education and outreach needs. Nearly 40% of respondents say that they are currently receiving information about appropriate waste sorting via labels on products, mail, and the internet. Among the few respondents that do not recycle, who say that they would be motivated to recycle more if they had clear information on what to recycle or had more access or had more accessible recycling information. More would prefer information via emails and infographics on waste bins. Nearly half of low-income and rural respondents express interest in learning more about which items go in which bins. And this is an overview of the Consumer Education and Access Study, and I'll pass it over to Jordan Sayer to speak on the next topic.
Hello, everybody. I am Jordan Sayer, an environmental scientist here at CalRecycle, and I will be walking us through the 3 current state reports of the collection, processing, and in-market study. This study examined CMC material flows at collection, processing, and in markets. The collection report assessed collection programs to collect covered materials, including on-site collection and other types. The processing report looked at processors that clean, sort, flake, or bale the covered material and transfer it to in markets. The in markets report focuses on facilities where material is converted into recycled feedstock to be used in lieu of virgin material, including composting and anaerobic digestion facilities. Across reports, CMCs were aggregated to the level of information that could be found. For example, with glass in markets group, all glass was grouped into one glass category because at that stage of our waste system, the material is often crushed and difficult to discern. As Javier previously mentioned, direct engagement for the CPEM study took the form of surveys and listening sessions. The Community Recycling and Composting Survey was designed to assess barriers, opportunities, and both positive and negative impacts of waste infrastructure in disadvantaged communities and priority populations. We received a total of 332 survey responses, 324 of which were from CBO and EJ groups, and 8 were from California Native American tribes. 10 listening sessions were also held with these groups during the study engagement period so that interested parties could provide feedback and context for their survey responses, as well as discuss the themes and topics presented in the surveys. The listening sessions also provided opportunities to facilitate further discussion on the barriers and opportunities related to the transition to a circular economy within their communities. This direct engagement also helped gather feedback on the studies as they were conducted and will help to inform future engagement with communities. Okay, next slide. The first report we will be looking at will be the current state of collection report. Here, the report studied the types of programs available to collect covered material categories, CMCs, access and participation in collection programs, costs of collection, contamination, and impacts on communities and the environment. Some highlights are 143 local jurisdictions were represented by survey responses, 16 community-based organizations, CBOs, and environmental justice, EJ groups, and 3 Native American tribes participated in the study. Access to on-site curbside collection is high in most of the state, though limited in some regions. Some of the key findings from the current state of collection report are that the access to curbside collection varies across the state, with some jurisdictions having full access while others had partial. Full access refers to local jurisdictions providing on-site collection services for solid waste and materials collected for recycling for all waste generators. Partial access refers to on-site curbside collection services that differ within a local jurisdiction. Here, an urban area with high density may receive full access, while a rural area with lower population density may have limited or no access to curbside collection. Access to collection and types of programs is high, with 87% of the state having full access to on-site curbside collection. As previously noted, the lowest access was in limited access regions, with coastal at 56% and mountain at 10% access. Despite having access to on-site collection, participation may vary because areas with access may have low subscription rates due to waivers, low awareness, and confidence in collection programs. The collection report also suggests acceptance of materials can vary by material type. aluminum, glass, mixed paper, paperboard, OCC, plastic, number 1, PET rigid, plastic, number 2, HDPE rigid, and tin, steel, bimetal are the most broadly accepted materials by on-site curbside collection services statewide. Ceramic, other multi-material laminate, plastic number 6, expanded or foamed plastic, rigid, and textiles are the materials least accepted in collection programs statewide. Acceptance and costs of collection of on-site curbside collection were also studied, and the report estimated 5.5 million tons of covered material was collected for recycling, and 1 million tons of covered material was collected for organics recycling. The average cost of collection statewide is $300 per ton, with the lowest in the southern region, $284 per ton, and the highest in the coastal region at $338 per ton. Contamination was found to increase costs on both ratepayers and local jurisdictions through fees and processing burden. Results from the Community Recycling and Composting Survey described in an earlier slide indicates that positive impacts of collection of material for recycling and organics recycling on communities and the environment were reducing litter and pollution, therefore resulting in cleaner neighborhoods, reducing greenhouse gas GHG emissions through diverting materials from landfill. The negative impacts of collection of material for recycling and organics recycling on communities and environment were that the increased waste filling landfills was a top concern of communities, and litter and illegal dumping were the most often identified impacts felt personally in the community, maybe linked to the lack of access to affordable collection, such as in the mountain region. Next, we have the current state of processing report, where acceptance and marketability of CMCs, costs, contamination, community and environmental impacts from processing facilities were assessed. Some highlights are the study identified 89 recycling processing facilities, RPFs, that receive 5.9 million tons of covered material. It also identified 58 active organics processing facilities that receive 313,400 tons of covered material. 16 CBOs and EJ groups and 3 tribes participated in the survey and listening sessions, as previously noted. The findings from their participation were integrated into study findings. Most processing facilities are in urban areas, as we can see on the map titled Location of Recycling Processing Facilities in California on the slide. Moving into the key findings from the current state of processing report. First, covered materials were evaluated on sortation feasibility and marketability. Sortation feasibility is the technical capacity of processors to effectively sort inbound materials by manual separation, magnets, mechanical screens, optical sorters, other equipment, and technology in the facility, such as processing arrays. Marketability is the cost effectiveness of separating commodities and delivering them to end markets. Next slide. Acceptance, sortation, and marketability of materials are influenced by material type, e.g. resin, and other material characteristics, operations and maintenance costs, as well as product manufacturing methods. The report separates materials into accepted, tolerable, and prohibited for acceptance, and high, variable, and limited for sortation and marketability at recycling processing facilities and organics processing facilities. Shown here is the marketability of CMCs at plastic recycling processing facilities. Here, materials with high marketability at plastics recycling processing facilities are plastic number 1, PET clear bottles, jugs, and jars. Plastic number 1, PET pigmented bottles, jugs, and jars. Plastic number 2, HDPE bottles, jugs, and jars. Plastic number 5, PP rigid. Plastic number 5, other PP. Materials with variable marketability are plastic number 1, other PET rigid. Plastic number 2, HDPE pails and buckets. Plastic number 2, other HDPE rigid. Plastic number 6, PS rigid items. Plastic number 6, other PS. And finally, materials with limited marketability are all types of flexible and film plastics. Plastic number 3, PVC rigid. Plastic number 4, LDPE bottles and jugs. Plastic number 6, EPS rigid items. Plastic number 7, other rigid plastics. Small format plastics, multi-material laminates, plastic-based textiles, and information on other material types at recycling processing facilities are in the report. The acceptance, sortation, and marketability of materials was also assessed for organics processing facilities. Here, marketability is shown. Many types of covered material have limited marketability at those facilities, with craft paper being the only material to have high marketability. Those with limited marketability are plastics designed for compostability, OCC, mixed paper, molded pulp, and untreated wood. The current state of processing report also addressed contamination. Contamination includes material that is not intended to be recycled and ends up in the recycling stream. Common sources of contamination include incorrectly discarded items, such as through consumer error or limitations in collection. Product design, such as packages with multiple bonded materials, may also result in incompatibilities with normal process flows and therefore contribute to contamination. The impacts of contamination can be increased operational downtime and costs, as well as contaminated commodities. Contamination reduces the portion of accepted material able to be recovered and the quality of the material received, which may necessitate further processing. Recycling processing facilities' main contaminants are flexibles and film, non-accepted plastic containers, and non-accepted paper products. Organics processing facilities' main contaminants are materials with a plastic component. And so pre-sorting and screening can improve product quality. Okay. Results from the Community Recycling and Composting Survey indicate that positive impacts of recycling and organics recycling could be the recycling of plastic waste, nutrient-rich compost production, less use of energy and resources compared to manufacturing new materials. The negative impacts of recycling and organics recycling on communities and environment are related to water pollution from chemicals used in processing and the increased consumption by the facilities. Participants in the listening sessions identified that key challenges and opportunities for communities with respect to processing are long distances to transport materials in tribal communities, insufficient funding causing delays in services being rolled out, and an opportunity was found in compensation, potentially being used as an incentive for residents to recycle. Lastly, for the current state reports, we will cover the current state of end markets report. Here, the report examines end market identification, where end markets were identified for materials in the state. Contamination was also studied, as well as material recovery, end-market viability, and costs. Some highlights are that many CMC groups have limited end markets or limited information on end markets, and market volatility impacts what processors recover and sell to end markets. Even materials with more developed end markets experience significant fluctuations in bale pricing, and the information on out-of-state end markets is limited. However, about 70% of covered material is sent to end markets that were estimated to go overseas. End markets that manage covered materials were identified with a focus on end market facilities located in California and also some in the United States. Notably, end market facilities that did not accept covered materials such as CRV items are not included. End markets for PET, HDPE, and PP and glass were identified in California. However, it was difficult to track the final disposition of materials, especially for those sent out of state. For example, for aluminum and steel, no in-state end markets were identified. Additionally, 3 end market facilities for paper and fiber in California were identified. However, only 2 responded to the survey sent out by the contractor, and only 1 provided compositional data. An out-of-state facility was identified in Mexico, but did not respond to requests for contact. As a result, some materials have limited end markets or limited information on end markets, including ceramics, metals, wood, and other organic materials, and some types of plastic. Organic recovery at composters and in-vessel digestion was estimated generally using surveys and contractor expertise or experience. Next slide. As for estimating material recovery at end markets, the weight of covered material, excluding contamination, as well as a CMC conversion rate, was estimated for each CMC end market group whenever possible. The amount of recovered material produced was estimated by multiplying the total tonnage of each CMC group accepted at each facility, excluding contamination, by the CMC conversion rate. The CMC conversion rate represents the percentage of the material that is converted into recycled product after it enters end markets. To illustrate the information estimated by CMC in market group, we can take a look at the table here on this slide, which is specific to glass covered material. It was estimated that about 223,000 tons of glass covered material were accepted by or sent to end markets, adjusted to remove the amount of contaminants. Glass in markets were estimated to have a 97% CMC conversion rate, meaning that of the glass accepted by those in markets, about 97% is made into recovered material. In this case, it was estimated that about 216,000 tons of covered material with an estimated 6,700 tons of not recovered, meaning it was disposed. The CMC conversion rates for CMC and market groups were estimated based on survey responses when possible. If no responses were provided, conversion rates were gathered through secondary research. The following materials have sufficient information on end markets to estimate CMC conversion rates. PET number 1, rigid, at a 66% conversion rate. HDPE number 2, rigid, at 82%. PP number 5, rigid, at 56%. PE plastic films at 89%. Glass at 97%. And paper and fiber at 91%. Now, I will transition to discussing some material class specific findings from this report. Starting with the glass material class, almost 100% of glass material grades were found to remain in state for recycling. Of the roughly 762,000 tons of glass material grades estimated to be accepted by end markets, about 223,000 are estimated to be covered material. Contamination in glass material grades can be high, with common contaminants being small format items of other material classes. 5 end market facilities indicated they were not operating at full capacity, which indicates there may be additional in-state capacity. While not shown on the screen, ceramics were also assessed. However, no ceramic end markets were identified. For the metal material class, all identified end market facilities were located outside California. An estimated 53% of metal covered material is exported domestically, with the remaining 47% exported internationally. Additional information is necessary to accurately estimate metal covered material reaching end markets. For the paper and fiber material classes, 3 end market facilities were identified in California, accepting mostly OCC and mixed paper. OCC comprises the majority of covered materials sent to end markets, followed by mixed paper, paperboard, and kraft paper. End markets for other types of paper were more limited. For the plastic material class, 17 end market facilities were identified that accept California covered material. 13 were in state. Of the roughly 269,000 tons of PET material grades accepted by or sent to end markets, about 31,000 tons were estimated to be covered material. These end markets face ongoing viability challenges. For wood and other material classes, untreated wood packaging are assumed to go to chip and grind facilities to make materials for mulch, animal bedding, and other products rather than being incorporated into composting or in-vessel digestion. Some composting and in-vessel digestion facilities accept and incorporate covered materials. However, much of this material is screened out during processing. Next slide. Contamination was found to decrease recovery across materials. HDPE and PP end markets suggest most contamination comes from missorting during processing. Flexibles, rigid plastics, glass, metals, and other plastic polymers are contaminants. For PET, labels and residue, non-covered material, small format plastics, and PP rigids are contaminants. For paper and fiber plastic film, flexible packaging, wax-coated paper, and pressure-sensitive adhesives are also commonly found as contaminants. In the case of glass, small format packaging, foil coatings on glass, ceramics, and plastic are contaminants. Lastly, some organics end markets reported they generally screen out packaging and products designed for compostability, especially if they look similar to their non-compostable counterparts. For the last of the current state of end markets key findings, market costs and viability were assessed. Costs of feedstock and labor are the 2 biggest ongoing costs for plastic and paper fiber end markets. Viability was influenced by variable costs of feedstock, competition with virgin materials, limited availability of feedstock due to international exports, and fall in demand for domestically recovered material. Plastic end markets reported operating below capacity due to affordable feedstock supply challenges. Glass in markets have underutilized capacity, operating between 15 and 76%, partially due to high rates of contamination. As for community impacts, in markets are primarily located around the San Francisco Bay Area, Sacramento, and Los Angeles. Census tracts within the San Joaquin, Stanislaus, and Kern counties are in the top 25th percentile of pollution burden and have the highest overlap with in-market locations. Only 12% of CBOs and EJ groups felt their community had access to programs about health risks and pollution. Okay. Before we transition to the needed state report, I'm going to briefly discuss how the data from the current state of processing and in-markets reports were used to estimate the recycling rates published on December 31st, 2025. The recycling rate means the amount of covered material recycled in a given year divided by the amount recycled plus disposed of in a given year. The recycling rates published as part of the CMC list were specific to covered materials. The amount recycled was sourced from reports I just described. Whenever possible, the amount of recovered material produced from covered materials sent to in-markets was used, which was estimated in the current state of in-markets report. If that number was not available, the estimated material outflow from the processing facilities was used on the current state of based on the current state of processing report. If that was the source of the estimated recycling rate, the recycling rate would include a less than sign in front of it. If neither of those pieces had information available, it was noted that there was currently insufficient information. The estimation of the recycling rate does not assume whether current in-markets meet the final standard and criteria required to be considered a responsible in-market. The source of disposal estimates were based on the composition found in the material characterization study required by the Act and reflective of the 2024 disposal based on data submitted to the Recycling and Disposal Reporting System, otherwise known as RDRS. Next, we will be moving to the needed state of collection, processing, and in-markets report, which will be presented by my colleague, Eric Payne.
Great for that. Thanks, Jordan. As mentioned, I'm Eric Payne. I'm an environmental scientist here at CalRecycle, and I will overview the needed state of collection, processing, and in-market study. In general, the needed state report focused on how the recycling rate, compostability, and recyclability requirements of the Act could be met given the current state of collection, processing, and end markets system as identified in the current state reports. The potential opportunities identified in the need state report are not meant to be prescriptive, but rather examples of potential steps. Next slide, please. The needed state report identified gaps in the system in order to meet the requirements of the Act. Speaking at a very high level, the report identified these gaps by comparing projected and current tons with the amounts that would be necessary to meet the Act's requirements. To develop potential solutions for these gaps, the report used surveys, literature, and expert input. Overall, one key finding is that material design choices will affect needed actions and investments due to the strong influence that material design has on recycling and composting system operations. For example, the needed upgrades to infrastructure will depend on the types of covered material in the system. Next slide, please. Thank you. For material design, in general, the report highlights that design could be standardized and simplified. Doing so will simplify the needed education for proper end-of-life management for covered material and therefore improve sorting of covered materials into the correct collection stream. This will have knock-on effects, increasing processing and in-market efficiency. Simplifying material design may also increase material recyclability and compostability. Materials may be redesigned in many possible ways. A few examples include removing plastic liners, replacing multi-material laminates with HDPE, using HDPE or LDPE for all flexible plastics, replacing plastics designed for compostability with PET or other traditionally recyclable plastics, and replacing ceramic with glass. Next slide, please. The CPIM Needed State Report identified several opportunities for improving the collection system. First, additional drop-off and other alternative collection systems could be developed, particularly in rural and other areas where access to on-site curbside collection is limited. Second, when engaging with the public to change behavior, multiple strategies could be used. For instance, educational materials should not be developed in a vacuum and could be implemented in combination with material design and clearer product end-of-life labeling. Educational campaigns, in addition, could also be focused on singular messages to reduce user fatigue and be provided in multiple region-specific languages. Such indirect messaging could also be supplemented with direct engagement with the public. And where feasible, pilot programs can be used to test the effectiveness of new methods. Third, contamination is a key issue at the collection stage. The report identified several methods of opportunities to reduce contamination. These methods include, again, material design and engaging with the public using the methods just described. Contamination can also be reduced by increasing access to convenient collection services and implementing contamination monitoring. For contamination monitoring, the report indicates that refusing to pick up contaminated carts seems to be more successful than immediately jumping to fees. Next slide, please. To improve processing of traditional recyclables, the report identified several opportunities. For example, new or enhanced infrastructure could focus on small format plastics, aseptics and gable-top cartons, flexible or film plastics, and plastics number 3 through 7. Likewise, mixed rigid, flexible, and film plastics may be good candidates for secondary processing. To improve processing at large, the report identified several options, such as the adoption of optical sorters with artificial intelligence or AI software, looped conveyors, and glass cleaning systems. For processing of organics, the report found that organics processing facilities were not generally interested in plastics designed for compostability and paper food serviceware with a plastic coating, especially when these items resembled their non-compostable counterparts. Instead, these materials could be shifted out of the organic stream through material design and contamination reduction initiatives. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, one slide back. To reduce contamination at both organics and traditional recycling processing facilities, the report identified several mechanisms such as inbound contamination auditing, manual pre-sorting, optical sorting to separate flexible film plastics, bale audits, adjusting screens and other sorting technologies to reduce tangling, and usage of AI to monitor the residue stream. Okay, now next slide. To improve the end market system for cover materials, opportunities vary by material. For plastics, the report notes that end markets that currently handle CRV could be upgraded to deal with non-CRV, especially for PET. Additional end market facilities may be needed for aseptics, gable tops, flexible and film plastics, and potentially also for rigid HDPE, LDPE, and PP. Outside of plastic, existing end market capacity may be sufficient for metal, glass, and paper fiber, assuming that collection and processing can be improved for these materials and that the relevant end markets are responsible. At processing facilities or glass end markets, upgrades could be implemented to capture small format paper and plastic. Further, enhancing end markets could be considered, such as by implementing long-term contracts across the supply chain and subsidizing the processing and recycling of cover material. Next slide, please. There are various other opportunities identified in the CPIM report, These include outreach and education related to illegal dumping and continual engagement with the public, including but not limited to during the design process for building new or upgrading existing infrastructure. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Marcus to take us into the Q&A section.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, thank you, Eric. We're going to take a short break before we do our Q&A session, but just wanted to set a couple reminders. Again, ways to stay informed. Feel free to sign up for the SB 54 listserv if you haven't already. QR code will take you directly to the webpage. We also have several updates that are posted to our webpage, so feel free to visit our webpage for more information. We also have a very specific statewide needs assessment webpage as well. And then, as always, for all questions, feel free to direct those to packaging@calrecycle.ca.gov. We'll go ahead and take a short break, so we'll have folks come back at about 3:06. And then just a reminder for those on Zoom, if you'd like to ask questions, we'll do the raise your hand function. You can also write directly to our public comments, contact directly in the Zoom. And then just a reminder for folks online that when you do post a question or come off mute, just please reminder to state your name and affiliation just to help our note takers as well as just tracking those public comments. But we'll go ahead and see you folks in a few minutes, and we'll be back shortly. Thanks so much.